they will show whether they are really going to stop covering up or they're going to protect these powerful abusers. If they redact these files heavily, it will be clear they are hiding something. Maybe it's because Donald Trump is mentioned 1,500 times. Maybe it's because they want to shield wealthy donors who are implicated in these files. Regardless of the reason, if these files are heavily redacted without justification, Americans will know that they are once again, this administration, siding with the rich and the powerful. Remember, if the president was actually serious about truth and transparency, his administration would have released these files months ago. All the way back in March, the Attorney General said everything is going to come out to the public. The public has a right to know. It's been 9 months. 9 months.
You have watched Senator Amy Klobuchar issue a scorching rebuke that cuts to the very marrow of what this moment represents. And we need to talk about what is actually happening here, because this is not simply a story about documents and redactions and government process. This is a story about power protecting itself at the expense of the most vulnerable human beings imaginable, and about an administration that has spent every single day of its existence constructing elaborate architectures of secrecy and obfuscation, while screaming from the rooftops about transparency. And what you just heard in that clip should make your blood run cold, because what Klobuchar is saying, without equivocation, is that Trump signed the bill requiring the DOJ to release the files within 30 days, and yet the Justice Department must release the Epstein files by Friday, and the Epstein survivors who spoke with CNN said that they had gotten no outreach from the DOJ ahead of the files' release, and for now they are entirely unaware of its timing and the contents. And that means what exactly? It means we are staring down the barrel of a potentially massive cover-up orchestrated at the highest levels of American government, and you should be asking yourself why a man who campaigned on releasing these files, pledged to release the Epstein files during his presidential campaign, would suddenly find every conceivable excuse to bury them once he had the power to do exactly what he promised. This is about Jeffrey Epstein. Yes, but it is about so much more than one dead predator, and we cannot allow ourselves to get lost in the salacious details without understanding the structural critique that must be at the center of this moment, because what we are witnessing is the complete breakdown of accountability for the ruling class in America, and Klobuchar is standing on the floor, making the argument that has to be made, which is that we're working with the victims' attorneys and legal experts familiar with this case to ensure full compliance of the law, and if the administration withholds some documents unlawfully, we will know, and if they abuse narrow exemptions to hide the truth, we will know. And this is the language of people who understand that they are dealing with an adversary that operates in pure bad faith. Consider what has already happened in this unfolding nightmare, because, according to Politico, following the reported briefing in May, Trump appears to have sought to narrow the government's public disclosures to avoid releasing information, and the DOJ, in an unsigned memo in July, said that a review of its Epstein-related materials revealed no incriminating client list, and the memo also included the agency's conclusion that no further disclosure would be appropriate or warranted, which is utterly extraordinary because they are essentially saying, there is nothing to see here, move along, when the Department of Justice's unreleased Epstein documents consist of nearly 100,000 pages, as well as 40 computers, 70 CDs, 26 storage drives, and 6 recording devices, which contain a collective 300 gigabytes of data. And according to the New Republic, physical evidence in the FBI's possession also includes photographs, travel logs, employee lists, blueprints of Epstein's island and Manhattan home, a logbook of visitors to Epstein's private island, and a list of names. And you want me to believe that in that mountain of evidence there is nothing the American people need to know? The depth of cynicism required to make that argument is staggering. But what should terrify us even more is the systematic way this administration has worked to create the conditions for this cover-up. And you need to understand the timeline here, because the House of Representatives passed the Epstein Files Transparency Act in a 427-1 vote, and the Senate would unanimously approve the bill the same day, sending it to Trump's desk the next morning, and Trump signed the bill the day he received it officially, requiring the DOJ to release the files within 30 days. But Trump only agreed to this after the Epstein files, and the president's handling of the controversy sparked rare disunity among Republicans in Congress and Trump supporters, and he spent months calling this entire thing a hoax. Trump had previously said he would sign the measure into law, even as he continued calling the largely Democrat-led push to release the files a hoax, and he used the Post to take more digs at Democrats, repeating his hoax characterization and arguing that they were seeking to try and distract from his administration's accomplishments, which is the rhetoric of someone who knows they have something to hide and is desperately trying to preemptively delegitimize whatever comes out. And we are not talking about some abstract concern about transparency in government. We are talking about the specific allegation that Donald Trump himself is implicated in these documents in ways that should absolutely disqualify him from holding any position of public trust, let alone the presidency. And Klobuchar says in the clip that Trump is mentioned 1,500 times, and while I want to be careful about that specific claim because I have not seen independent verification of that precise number, what we absolutely know is that Democrats on the House Oversight Committee released a set of emails involving Epstein, in which he wrote "the dog that hasn't barked is Trump," and mentioned that Trump had spent hours with one of the victims, and House Democrats released emails suggesting Trump knew more about Epstein's conduct. In a 2011 email, Epstein alleged that an individual whose name was redacted spent hours with Trump at Epstein's house, and in a 2019 email, Epstein had a line that said Trump knew about the girls, an apparent reference to the president's past claim that he banned Epstein from his Mar-a-Lago club for allegedly approaching young women who worked there. So we have Epstein himself, in his own words, saying that Trump knew and spent time with victims, and the administration wants to tell us there is nothing in these files that matters. This is the moment where we have to connect this specific atrocity to the broader pattern of corruption and authoritarian behavior that has defined this administration from its very first day, because since the start of President Trump's second term in January, the Trump administration consistently sought to evade accountability, and it has engaged in a series of unprecedented, irresponsible, and often illegal steps reversing long-standing bipartisan commitments to integrity and transparency through actions that will increase the risk of fraud and make it more difficult to impartially determine when the administration is taking illegal or imprudent action, and the president's January mass firing of IGs was, according to a district court judge, an obvious violation of the Inspector General Act, and the first time in over 4 decades that a president removed any IGs at the start of a presidential term, and in the first week of the Trump administration the president illegally removed without cause 15 of the 25 presidentially appointed and Senate-confirmed IGs who were serving at the beginning of his administration, which means he has systematically dismantled the oversight mechanisms that would expose wrongdoing and create accountability. You fire the watchdogs, and then you do whatever you want in the dark, and when people start asking questions you call it a hoax, and you attack the media, and you weaponize your Department of Justice to go after your enemies, and this is the textbook definition of authoritarian governance. Epstein files matter not just because of what they might reveal about powerful men and their crimes, but because they represent a test of whether we still have a functioning system of justice in this country, or whether we have descended fully into oligarchy, where the rich and powerful simply operate by different rules, and the rest of us are expected to shut up and accept it. And Klobuchar is making the argument explicitly when she says that if they redact these files heavily, Americans will know that they are once again this administration siding with the rich and the powerful, and she is pointing to a pattern of behavior that we can document across every single dimension of this administration's operation, because the evidence is clear that the second Trump administration is a powder keg of corruption scandals, influence peddling and profiteering from public service, and the American people are the ones bearing the costs of Trump's self-enrichment and selling of access and influence to the highest bidder, and we have seen this play out in real time with Justin Sun, a Chinese-born crypto billionaire who purchased massive amounts of Trump's meme coin and World Liberty financial tokens, and after Sun's massive investments in Trump's cryptocurrency ventures, the Security and Exchange Commission abruptly paused a fraud case against him, which is naked corruption right out in the open. What makes the Epstein situation even more disturbing is that Trump and his allies have tried to turn this into a partisan issue when Trump reversed his position and urged Republicans to support the measure, and Reps Thomas Massie and Ro Khanna, the bipartisan duo who co-authored the legislation, successfully forced the vote on the House floor, despite leadership's objections, and the votes in both chambers exceeded their expectation, with a final vote tally in the House of 427-1, with Rep Clay Higgins the only lawmaker to vote no. So this is not Democrats trying to score political points. This is the overwhelming consensus of Congress and the American people that these files must be released, and the only people standing in the way are the people who have something to hide. Trump has tried to deflect by ordering the DOJ to investigate Epstein's involvement with banks and prominent Democratic figures, including Bill Clinton, Lawrence Summers, and Reid Hoffman, and on Truth Social Trump wrote this is another Russia scam, with all arrows pointing to the Democrats, but this is classic authoritarian misdirection, where you accuse your enemies of the exact thing you are doing to muddy the waters and create confusion. And we need to talk about what it means that between January 2025 and July 2025, FBI personnel worked 4,737 overtime hours, costing the U.S. government over $851,000 to redact files related to the Epstein investigation, because they are spending nearly $1 million in taxpayer money to hide information from taxpayers. In response to a FOIA lawsuit, the FBI withheld all sorts of material related to its review and redaction of the Epstein files, and intriguingly, the FBI said it searched client lists to locate documents, so they acknowledge that client lists exist even while claiming publicly that no such list exists. And this is the kind of contradiction that reveals the lie at the center of the entire operation. The infrastructure of cover-up is being built in real time, with massive resources being deployed to ensure that the truth never sees the light of day, and Klobuchar is warning us that when these files finally do come out, if they come out, they are going to be so heavily redacted that they will be meaningless and we will have no way of knowing what was actually in them. This brings us to the fundamental question of what transparency means in a democracy, and whether we still believe in the principle that the people have a right to know what their government is doing, especially when it involves potential criminal conduct by the most powerful person in the country. And Klobuchar, who sits on the Senate Judiciary Committee, said this has gotten to the point where they have just sown distrust in the justice system, and said to me as a former prosecutor, "There are times when you release things for the good of the country, and this is one of those times." And she is absolutely right, because the damage to our democratic institutions from this kind of sustained cover-up is catastrophic and irreversible. When people lose faith that justice will be done, when they see with their own eyes that the powerful can commit crimes and face no consequences while poor people go to prison for stealing bread, the entire social contract breaks down, and we are left with nothing but brute force and the exercise of power for its own sake. The Trump administration has pioneered new frontiers of opacity and secrecy that go far beyond even what we saw in his first term, and numerous federal websites and databases have been taken down over the last 6 months, depriving the public, experts, and government officials of crucial health and scientific data, criminal case files of individuals who participated in the January 6th insurrection, information about law enforcement misconduct, and resources on teen dating violence, preventing postpartum depression, and similar topics. And federal district judge ordered the White House Office of Management and Budget to restore a website it abruptly took down in March that discloses how the office directs executive branch agencies to spend taxpayer funds appropriated by Congress, and the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals unanimously denied the Trump administration's emergency request to halt that ruling and ordered it to promptly restore the spending database, which means they are actively hiding from Congress and the American people how they are spending our money. This is not normal, and we cannot allow it to be normalized, because once we accept that the government can simply delete information that is politically inconvenient, we have lost any meaningful ability to hold power accountable. The survivors of Epstein's abuse have been trying to make their voices heard throughout this entire nightmare, and the anticipation alone has been immensely challenging for survivors of his crimes. Epstein's past associations with many of the world's most powerful and wealthy people, including Trump, coupled with the decades of failure by the justice system to hold him accountable, have also made Epstein a prime example of systemic corruption, and these women have been failed over and over again by a system that was designed to protect wealthy predators. Epstein served just 13 months in prison for state prostitution charges involving underage girls, after he was given a highly controversial non-prosecution agreement in 2007, and Alex Acosta, the U.S. attorney in Florida, who declined to bring federal charges against Epstein at the time, also failed to notify the women who alleged they had been abused by Epstein about the agreement, and Acosta later served as labor secretary during Trump's first term, so the same administration that gave Epstein a sweetheart deal that let him walk free employed one of the architects of that deal in a senior position, and now that same political operation wants us to trust them to release these files in good faith? What Klobuchar is doing in this clip is speaking truth to power in a way that cuts through all the obfuscation and gaslighting, and she is saying explicitly that if these files are heavily redacted without justification, Americans will know that this administration is siding with the rich and the powerful against victims of horrific abuse. And this is the moral clarity we need right now, because we are at a point where the political elite on both sides have been so thoroughly corrupted by money and access that they have lost the ability to see ordinary people as fully human. The Epstein case is the perfect crystallization of this dynamic, because it involves the literal abuse of children by men who believed they were untouchable because of their wealth and power, and the fact that so many of them were right that they were untouchable should haunt us, and should drive us to demand a complete overhaul of how justice works in this country. The clip mentions that Trump is mentioned 1,500 times, and regardless of whether that precise number is accurate, What matters is that FBI personnel were instructed to flag any records in which President Trump was mentioned, and in the documents the FBI found dozens of high-profile names including Trump's, and a unit of FOIA officers citing exemptions in FOIA law redacted Trump's name because although he was then a sitting president, he had been a private citizen when the 2006 federal investigation into Epstein began, which means they went through and systematically removed his name from documents to protect him. This is not transparency. This is the deliberate suppression of evidence, and it is happening right now in plain sight, and Klobuchar is trying to sound the alarm before it is too late to do anything about it because once these files come out heavily redacted, the window for action closes, and we are left with conspiracy theories and speculation instead of facts. The bipartisan nature of the legislative push to release these files is itself a rebuke to Trump's attempts to politicize this issue, because Massie Khanna and Rep. Marjorie Taylor Greene held an emotional news conference outside the Capitol, with more than a dozen Epstein survivors urging senators to quickly take up the bill, and GOP Rep. Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia said this should have never ever happened, and this is the biggest fight I think I've seen in Washington, D.C., and this is a fight we should have never had to wage, so even members of Trump's own MAGA base understand that this is indefensible, and that is significant because it means the pressure is coming from all directions, and the only people who want these files buried are the people who are implicated in them. We need to understand that this is not just about what Trump did or did not do with Epstein. This is about whether we are going to continue to tolerate a system where powerful men can abuse vulnerable women and girls with impunity, secure in the knowledge that their wealth and connections will protect them from consequences, and Klobuchar is making the argument that this administration has shown over and over again that it will protect powerful abusers, and that if the files are heavily redacted, it will be because Donald Trump is protecting himself and his wealthy donors. The law permits Bondi to withhold or redact information that could jeopardize a federal investigation. Thomas Massie expressed concern that if they have ongoing investigations in certain areas, those documents can't be released, and this might be a big smokescreen. These investigations to open a bunch of them as a last-ditch effort to prevent the release of the Epstein files, which is exactly what appears to be happening, because Bondi, acquiescing to a request from Trump, said last week that she had assigned Manhattan U.S. Attorney Jay Clayton to investigate Epstein's ties to several of the president's perceived foes. So they are opening new investigations specifically to create legal justification for withholding documents. The contempt for democratic norms and institutions that this represents is breathtaking, and we are watching in real time as an administration that claims to be the most transparent in history systematically dismantles every mechanism of accountability and transparency that previous generations fought to establish, and the Trump administration has repeatedly claimed to be the most transparent in history, but nothing could be further from the truth. And in reality, the public's right to know has never been under greater threat, and this is not hyperbole. This is the assessment of people who have spent their entire careers fighting for transparency and open government across administrations of both parties. The assault on transparency is deliberate and coordinated, and it extends to every corner of the federal government, from the deletion of websites, to the firing of inspectors general, to the weaponization of classification, to hide embarrassing information. Klobuchar's warning that Americans will past them know if they are protecting powerful abusers is both a promise and a threat, and it needs to be backed up with real consequences, because knowing about corruption means nothing if we do not act on that knowledge, and this is where the progressive movement needs to be absolutely relentless in demanded accountability. We cannot accept half measures or heavily redacted documents or promises that the investigation is ongoing. We need the full, unvarnished truth released to the public immediately, and if this administration refuses to comply, then Congress needs to use every tool at its disposal, including inherent contempt, to compel compliance, and if that fails, then the American people need to take to the streets and make it clear that this will not stand. The deadline is approaching and the law requires DOJ to release the files by Friday, December 19th, and we fully expect Trump, Bondi, and their minions to dodge delay or partially release these files, and if they release some documents and hide others, the American people will see right through it. And Schumer is exactly right, because we know what is coming, and we need to be prepared to respond with overwhelming force when it happens. This cannot be allowed to fade from the news cycle. This cannot become just another Trump scandal that we move past after a week. This has to be the line where we say enough is enough, and demand that our institutions actually function the way they are supposed to function. The fact that backers of the legislation and survivors of Epstein held news conference on Capitol Hill to urge lawmakers to support the release of the files, and some of the survivors directly criticized the president, with one Jana Lisa Jones urging him to please stop making this political, should shame everyone involved in the cover-up, because these women have suffered unimaginable trauma and they are still fighting for justice years later, and the response from the government is to hide evidence and protect the powerful men who harmed them. This is obscene, and it should be treated as the moral atrocity that it is, and every single person who aids in this cover-up should be held accountable, and their names should be remembered. What we are witnessing is the complete collapse of the promise that America is a nation of laws, not of men, and the emergence of a two-tiered justice system where the rules only apply to people without power, and Klobuchar is standing up and saying that this is unacceptable and that if they try to hide the truth, Americans will know exactly what they are doing and why. The question is what we do with that knowledge, because outrage without action is just performative politics, and we are well past the point where we can afford to be performative about anything. This requires sustained organized resistance, and it requires us to connect this specific fight to the broader struggle against oligarchy and authoritarianism and corruption in all its forms, because the Epstein files are just one front in a much larger war for the soul of American democracy. Senator Klobuchar has laid down the gauntlet, and now it is up to us to pick it up and fight.